All right, we're back. And we are going to be taking a look today at Rousseau's Social Contract, full title, The Social Contract or the Principles of Political Right. This was written subsequently to the um, first and second discourses. The second discourses, of course, is uh, the document we just finished examining, where we looked at Rousseau's uh, uh, excavation of natural man. We recall he accused natural law and social contract, state of nature theorists like Hobbes and Locke of not going far back enough into our history. And so we undertook this investigation and discovered that underneath civilized man, there were, in fact, two previous versions of man. One, natural man, who lived a solitary and brutish, essentially animalistic existence. And then an in between stage, I call it in between, but Rousseau thinks it's the stage at which we spent most of our existence and perhaps the stage at which we were meant to remain, what he sometimes refers to as savage man. And again, his depiction here is something out of our own sort of popular cultural conceptions of native life, the life of indigenous peoples. So relatively simple, rustic, sort of bucolic, mostly peaceful and harmonious coexistence with each other and with nature, few material possessions, no property and land, um, no settled agriculture or metallurgy. And of course, it's the advent of agricultural and metallurgy and then property that sends us off into this sort of reinforcing cycle of material inequality and finally legal and political tyranny. So, what the social contract does is it sort of goes to the next step. So, if this is where we find ourselves in the condition described by Rousseau at the end of the second discourse. And recall that the situation we arrive at some point in the decline from savagery to civilization, it looks a lot like Hobbes' state of nature, right? So there are haves and there are have-nots. They're mutually dependent upon one another, but they're likewise scared to death of one another. The haves are scared that the have-nots will rise up in acts of violence. The have-nots are scared of other have-nots, and they're also scared of the exploitation at the hands of the haves. And so we are sort of thrown into the conditions of war that make legal and political organization inevitable. So the question for Rousseau that he seeks to answer in the social contract is, given this state of things, given how far we've fallen, given that, and this is actually quite important, and I think undergrads sometimes get confused on this point, given the fact that we cannot go back to nature, right? There is no return to the natural state. We can no longer return to the lives of animals. But likewise, there is no return to the savage state, what Rousseau understands as the savage state. We're not going to break apart our machines. We're not going to relearn all of the arts and survival techniques that we once had. We're just sort of stuck here. And the question becomes then, given the fact that we're stuck here, how do we organize ourselves in such a way, which is to say, how do we found a civil society or a state, which allows us to be free, which allows us to reclaim and to regain our freedom? And so that's the task he sets out for himself in the social contract is how can we be both modern, i.e., how can we live under the conditions that we've created for ourselves and be free? Okay. Um, so we can see this posture here in book one. I'm sorry, not book one. This is sort of a prologue, as it were, to book one. The social contract itself is divided up into four books. We're going to spend most of our time here in book one, though I think so. Tomorrow on the syllabus, we had it listed as a Rousseau catch-up day. And I think I'm just going to assign just a couple of chapters from book two, just very briefly, to sort of round out our discussions of the social contract and Rousseau more generally. But here's what he says in this little preface to book one. I intend to examine whether in the ordering of society there can be any reliable and legitimate rule of administration, taking men as they are and laws as they can be. So the key phrase here is taking men as they are. Given what we have become, given the fact that we are civilized, given the fact that there is no return to the natural or to the savage states, how is it possible to set up a legitimate rule of administration? I shall try throughout my inquiry to combine what is allowed by right with what is prescribed by self-interest in order that justice and utility should not be separated. Okay. Now, we start with chapter one, the opening lines of which are relatively well known. In fact, you may be familiar with these opening lines. Um, Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. So this idea that we're born free, this is Rousseau's commentary. I mean, I don't know if it's a commentary so much as it is Rousseau reflecting on the fact that by the time he's writing, so by the mid 18th century, the 1760s, it is by now clear, right? We're 100 years um, after the advent of natural law, after the advent of natural rights. We're almost 100 years after Locke, after the Revolution of 1688. In other words, we've had 100 years of Enlightenment views on the nature of freedom, the nature of man, and we know now what we maybe didn't know 500 years ago, what we maybe didn't know 1,000 years ago, which is that we are born free, which is that something about our nature, something about the moral order that is inherent in the nature of things requires that, as Jefferson puts it in 1776, we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights and that we're created equal. Right? By the time Rousseau was writing, this is a kind of commonplace. Everyone sort of knows this. We know that we're born free. And yet, despite the fact that we're born free, we look around and we see that everywhere we're in chains. So Rousseau is writing, of course, he's Swiss. He spent a lot of time in France. By the time Rousseau is writing, we're well into the reign of Louis the 15th, the French monarchy, well into the 18th century, is still seen as one of the more powerful, one of the more absolute monarchies in Europe. And so he's looking around Europe, he's looking around in France and Germany, Spain and elsewhere, and he's saying, listen, it's the case that we're born free, and now we're 100 years into knowing that we're born free, and yet why we all live under absolute monarchies. Even in places like Britain, we don't have universal suffrage. We don't have widespread representation. We are by no stretch of the imagination free in the way that we must naturally be. So how can it be that we're born free and yet everywhere we are in chains? And so what Rousseau wants to do is to re-examine the foundations of this unfreedom, re-examine the conditions of freedom, and to imagine a way of living within a nation state, of living within one of these centralized political organizations that has characterized Western politics since the 17th century, the thing that Hobbes described in chapter 17 of Leviathan. How is it that we can live in one of these and yet remain as free as we were before? And this is how he phrases it in chapter 6. We're going to skip up to chapter 6 here. Chapter 6 is titled The Social Pact. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking very closely here at chapter 6. So here's what he writes on page 54. I make the assumption that there is a point in the development of mankind at which the obstacles to men's self-preservation in the state of nature are too great to be overcome by the strength that any one individual can exert in order to maintain himself in this state. The original state can then subsist no longer, and the human race would perish if it did not change its mode of existence. Now, as men cannot generate new strength, but only unify and control the forces already existing, the sole means that they still have of preserving themselves is to create, by combination, a totality of forces sufficient to overcome the obstacles resisting them, to direct their operation by a single impulse, and to make them act in unison. Now, one thing keep always in view as we walk through Rousseau's version of the creation of the social compact is just how much it looks like Hobbes's. So if we look at the way that he phrases it here, we can't exist in our original state anymore. Why? Because our self-preservation requires that we combine with others. Our self-preservation can no longer be maintained in a state of nature. So we must combine with others. In what way will we combine with others? Well, we're going to combine with them in such a way as to create, by combination, a totality of forces sufficient to overcome the obstacles resisting them, i.e., protect us from others and from invaders. And how will it do it? To direct their operation by a single impulse and make them act in unison. Recall Hobbes's phrase that the sovereignty or the commonwealth he creates in chapter 17 is a real unity of them all. Direct their operation by a single impulse, a single voice. This process of incorporation that we discussed, and remember the frontispiece of Leviathan, to make them act in unison. Excuse me. So the question now becomes, how do we do this? How do we do this thing that Hobbes talked about and that Rousseau is here talking about? How do we combine with one another and combine in such a way that we're all directed by a single impulse? How do we do it in such a way that we remain free? The totality of forces, here we're picking up at the next paragraph, the totality of forces can be formed only by the collaboration of a number of persons, but each man's strength and freedom being the main instruments of his preservation, how can he commit them to others without harming himself and without neglecting the duty of care to himself? The difficulty as it relates to my subject may be defined in the following terms. So here's how he phrases the problem that the social contract is the answer to. The problem we have is to find a form of association which will defend and protect, with the whole of its joint strength, the person and property of each associate, and under which each of them, uniting himself to all, will obey himself alone and remain as free as before. This is the fundamental problem to which the social contract gives the answers. So understanding this question, in particular, understanding the paradoxical nature of this question, is the key to understanding Rousseau's social contract and the role played by this thing called the general will, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So the question is this: we're trying to combine with others, and to combine with others in such a way that all of our efforts will be directed by a single voice, which means then I'm going to be directed. When I enter into this compact, I'm going to be directed by some force. I'm going to be, in some important sense, controlled by some other force. So Hobbes's view is like, listen, yeah, you give it up. Like you say, I'll abide by this one person, provided you abide by this one person as well, and I agree to be the author of all their actions. But you don't get any say in that. You're simply saying, what's necessary for my protection, what's necessary for my survival is that we all listen, obey this one person, as if we were the author of all of its actions. All right, that's what we agree to in Hobbes. And that's essentially what Rousseau was requiring us to agree to as well. The fundamental difference is this. For Hobbes, this means a loss of freedom. And for Hobbes, that's not just fine. Freedom isn't just something that Hobbes is willing to give up in order to enter into this arrangement. Recall that for Hobbes, natural freedom, right, natural right, the infinite natural right we have to all things, including the bodies of others, is the problem that has to be overcome. So in fact, part of the whole point of the social contract is that we're getting rid of this natural freedom. So Hobbes doesn't see the loss of individual freedom as a loss. He sees it not as a feature, not as a bug, but as a feature. Right? It's part of the whole point of this. We got to get outside of this arrangement in which we all have this infinite individual right. But here Rousseau says, no, listen, not only does this arrangement have to be sufficiently organized, sufficiently forceful to protect us, sufficiently unified, sufficiently united, all in one impulse and one voice to protect us and to protect us sufficiently. But this additional and apparently totally paradoxical element, we also have to remain free. not only free, we have to remain as free as we were before we entered into this arrangement. So here's what he says and how we can kind of cut through this paradox, this Gordian knot we've set for ourselves here. The clauses of this contract are so closely determined by the nature of the act in question that the slightest blah 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 blah. Properly understood, the clauses can all be reduced to one alone, namely the complete transfer of each associate with all his rights to the whole community. For in the first place, each giving himself completely, the condition is the same for all, and the condition being the same for all, none has any interest in making it burdensome to the other. Further, the transfer being carried out unreservedly, the union between the associates is as perfect as it can be, and none of them has any further requirements to add. Next paragraph. Finally, each in giving himself to all gives himself to none. And since there are no associates over whom he does not acquire the same rights as he cedes, he gains the equivalent of all that he loses and the greater strength for the conservation of what he possesses. So this is all somewhat confusing. For Hobbes, we give ourselves over entirely, but we give ourselves over to some person or some assembly of persons. For Hobbes, for Rousseau, and this is crucial, we give ourselves over to no one. We all give ourselves over equally and absolutely to no one, right? Not to any particular person, not to an assembly of persons, not to any aristocratic body, not to any single monarch. We give ourselves over to everyone all at once, to everyone and therefore to no one. We see at the bottom of the page, if therefore we set aside everything that is not essential to the social pact, we shall find that it may be reduced to the following terms. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and we as a body receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. So this idea of the general will, this is the thing that makes this theory go. So on the one hand, we give ourselves over to no one, right? Not any particular person, which means that we aren't subject to anyone. But the thing that we give ourselves over to is everyone. It is the collective. Now, what difference does it make that it's a collective? Well, the collective, which is to say the general population, everyone who's engaged in this pact, everyone together. Rousseau thinks when everyone comes together, there is in that collective, in this unity, there is a kind of general body of them all. You might call it a general interest. If you were like being metaphysical about it, you could call it a general soul or a general being or something like that. But just even in the way that we talk about these things commonly, we could say that, like, yeah, sure, we each have individual interests, but most collectivities also have an interest. So as a professor at some level, I'm responsible for undertaking what is in the interest of the class. You guys probably came from families, in which case, right, each individual member of the family has an individual interest, but the family itself has a collective interest, what's best for the family, as it were. Even larger groups. So if you go to church, for example, each member at church has an individual interest, but at the same time, the collectivity, the church itself, the congregation, right, the priest or the pastor or whomever is responsible for tending to what is best for the congregation. And so that's all he means here, is that any collectivity, particularly the ones that are very tightly associated with one another, a kind of common interest will emerge out of this. Not only will a kind of common interest emerge out of this, because if there is a common interest, if there is a general interest that emerges from the collectivity, there is also, Rousseau thinks, a kind of general will that can emerge from the collectivity, which simply to say that will that corresponds with that interest, right? Now, this does not mean like majority vote. And Rousseau is very careful to say that the general will is not the same as a majority. Generally speaking, he thinks the general interest, assuming everyone is really and truly dedicated to the collectivity, assuming everyone is dedicated to the collectivity, there will always be something that's clearly in the general interest. In the same way that, for the most part, in my day-to-day goings on, usually when I act on my own self-interest, I have a very clear idea of what's in my self-interest. Likewise with any collectivity, particularly the very tightly assembled collectivities. They're going to have needs. They're going to have, common needs. They're going to have common interests, They're going to have common goals, right? And if they're particularly unified, these will be very clear, which means then that the general will, the will that corresponds with these needs and goals and interests, that will likewise be very clear. So the way the general will cuts this Gordian knot of how we can be subject to coercion and organization on the one hand, and yet remain as free as we were before. The way the general will cuts this Gordian knot is in this way. Um, we don't, we normally don't say that when we create rules for ourselves, we thereby make ourselves unfree. So, for example, if I set an alarm clock, I'm going to bed. I know I got to get up in the morning, and so I set an alarm clock. Now, what that alarm clock does is it presents a certain kind of constraint on me. It is going to, I mean, assuming that I actually wake up rather than just hit snooze or whatever, it assumes that I'm going to be doing what I want to be doing. I'm going to be indulging in certain passions. I mean, engaging in certain material self-interest that I have, namely sleep. And it's going to stop me from doing that. It's going to restrain me in some important way. But no one would say that the alarm clock, in waking me up from my slumbers, no one would say that the alarm clock is making me unfree. Now, if someone came from outside my house, someone I didn't know, and for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with me, for reasons that only had to do with them, right? If they were just some kind of maniacal, they were dedicated to the idea that no one should sleep in past a certain time, and they were just going around waking people up for no reason at all. Now, in that case, if he comes in and wakes me up, I'm made unfree because my plans, my intentions have been foiled by someone who does not have my interests at heart, but who rather is serving their own interests. Right? They're coercing me into being awake. They're violating my freedom in that case. They're making me unfree. But the alarm clock that I've set for myself, that doesn't make me unfree. In fact, there's a sense in which that alarm clock actually represents my freedom. It represents my freedom to make rules for myself, to direct myself, to align my own actions with what I think I ought to be doing. So in fact, a restraint that I place on myself is not just does it not make me unfree, but it actually makes me more free because it represents, in a sense, my reason acting upon my irrational impulses or irrational wishes and desires. So restraints that I place on myself are not instances of unfreedom, but rather are instances of freedom. So what Rousseau thinks can happen is this. Rousseau thinks that it's possible to so closely align ourselves with the general interest, to so closely associate ourselves with this general interest, the interest of this collectivity that we're engaged in, that when it acts and when it places restraints upon itself, it doesn't make us unfree. So for Rousseau, what's happening here is I used to be this individual person. Now I've joined this collectivity and I have so completely endorsed the values, the needs, the wants, the interests of this collectivity that my own individual will kind of fades to the background. Now that I no longer have this kind of individual will, now that I identify most closely with the community. Now, when the community acts, when it places rules on itself, I don't see them as an imposition. I don't see them as making me unfree. In fact, I actually see them as the conditions of my freedom. In the same way that placing a restraint on myself in the case of the alarm clock, that's an expression of my individual freedom. Likewise, if I so closely associate with the collectivity that when the community makes rules for itself, I see this as me making rules for myself, then in that case, a community's laws won't be instances of unfreedom, rather, they will be instances of my freedom. Now, normally in class, I would stop here and like check the room, make sure that people are following me because this is not a straightforward concept, but it's at the same time, it's pretty much the central concept to Rousseau's social contract. I'll give you one more, I guess, thought experiment, not really an experiment, just an example to illustrate this difference. So, um, imagine you're back in ancient Greece, and we're members of A city state, typically the way these city states were arranged is that you'd have the urban center, Athens or Sparta, whatever, and then the city state would kind of incorporate the surrounding farmlands. So these farmlands were usually owned by relatively wealthy um, people, but the point is that they would perform most of the agricultural labor, and then they would bring the goods to market, and they'd be exchanged for other things. And each city state had a different political economy. It's not really important. But imagine the following situation. So we're in Athens or Sparta or whatever, and it's been determined with certainty that the upcoming winter is going to be particularly harsh. And not only is it going to be particularly harsh, but several incoming shipments of grain have been delayed and may even not arrive at all. So the city is facing a potentially catastrophic grain shortage. And so it is being proposed in the public forum. It's being proposed that all of the grain from the surrounding areas, all of the grain from the territories that correspond with our city state, ought to be requisitioned. All right. So in other words, it's um, going to be seized by the state. Maybe they're offering, a pittance in exchange for it, but just in general, in order to get through the winter, it's being proposed that all of the grain farmers have their grain seized by the city and distributed among the people. So you, in this case, are a grain farmer, and this is what's being proposed. Now, what Rousseau is asking is this. If you're just an individual, if you're going to this public forum in the way that we go, we as Americans in 2025, the way that we go to the polls, right? When we go to the polls now, we're expected to vote our interest or vote in the way that we identify or something like that. So we assume that Americans vote along their class interests, right? So if you're a member of the wealthy classes, you're expected to vote for lower taxes. If you're a member of the lower classes, you're expected to vote for greater redistribution. We're expected to vote along our lines of our uh, demographic, our ethnic and religious and racial identities, right? So if you are rural, you vote a particular way. If you're from an urban population, you vote a particular way. And just generally speaking, we expect when people go to the polls, they vote for a set of policies that they think is going to benefit them, that they think is going to benefit people like them. That's what we expect people to do. And it's the job of the parties to convince them that our party platform will better serve your interests, right? That's what we expect in American democracy. Now, under that expectation, Rousseau would say, under that expectation, when you go to the public forum as a member of the grain holding class, as a grain farmer, you are going to oppose this proposition with every ounce of effort that you have. You're going to call friends of yours and you're going to ask them to talk publicly against the measure. You're going to call whatever business colleagues you have and you're going to say, please go around and tell people to vote against it. You're going to do everything you can because this is going to ruin you, right? They're going to take a year's worth of your harvest, give you almost nothing in return, and it's going to be potentially quite ruinous for you. In other words, your individual interest cries out against this measure. This is a terrible idea. This is going to ruin me in particular. And you're going to vote no. And you're going to do everything you can to get others to vote no as well. And of course, likewise, if you live in the city and you don't have a lot of money anyway, you're gonna vote for this measure. You're faced with like potential starvation. Grain's going to get extremely expensive. You're like, I don't want to deal with this. I would rather the city just provide these sorts of things for me. Now, in this case, Rousseau says, in this case, if the measure passes and they come to take your grain, you are definitely going to feel that like it's an unfreedom. You are going to feel like they are making you less free. You don't want them to take your grain. You voted against this proposition. You have no interest whatsoever. And in fact, you will be materially harmed, potentially quite greatly materially harmed when they show up and take your grain. You don't want this at all. You see this as theft. Theft is one of the most fundamental forms of unfreedom. And so in this case, when they come to take your grain, boy, you're really unfree. And you're going to be really unhappy about this. And you might even say something like, this is slavery, right? Someone coming in and just taking all my stuff like this is slavery. I don't care if the people voted on it. This is injustice. But what? if, Rousseau says, what if, when you go to that meeting, instead of seeing the problem as you yourself, instead of seeing the problem as Dr. Turner, the grain farmer who's going to be ruined by this, what if I'm able to distance myself from this individual identity that I have? What if I'm able to remember that I have united myself with everyone, a real unity of all with all? And I have agreed with them that I will alienate myself entirely. I will give myself and all of my goods and all of my interests over entirely to the collective will, provided everyone else does as well. Right? I remember that oath that I made. And now I'm thinking, well, I'm not being called upon to evaluate this in terms of how it will affect me. I'm not being asked to say what I personally would do or what's in my interest. What I'm being asked to do is to identify the collective interest, the general interest that emerges out of all of us collectively. And I'm being asked to evaluate this proposition on the basis of what's best for that collective. Now, if we can see it from this perspective, we can see how we might actually be able to agree with the proposition. We might be able to say, listen, this is going to ruin me personally, financially, but I'm not the important thing here. What's important is the community. Now, think about it again. I've emphasized over and over again, this is going to be strongest in the communities, in the collectivities that are most unified. So think about a really strong association. Think about a family, for example. We make sacrifices for families all the time, right? So, I mean, think about what your parents sacrificed on your behalf. Think about a spouse who's willing to forego, professional promotion in order to let their partner work out their dreams, or think about someone who has to quit their job to care for their husband or their wife full time. Right? These are major sacrifices, and I think while they might breed a certain kind of resentment over time, for the most part, spouses, particularly in good marriages, are more than willing to do so. They don't see it at all as a form of unfreedom. They don't see it at all as something that someone is doing to them. They say, listen, I am in a union, right? I am in a family. And what's good for the family, what's good for the union, what's good for these other people is more important than what's good for me. And more importantly, my own good is tied up inextricably from the good of this particular community. There is no such thing as me succeeding, me prospering, while my wife wastes away from some disease, while my wife doesn't get to do all the things that she wanted to do. In other words, I can't be successful. I can't be free unless everyone in my collective unit is free and successful. So that's what he's saying is possible here. If we can so completely and totally alienate our own interests, our own self, over to this collective self, these collective interests, if we can align ourselves, in other words, perfectly, we align ourselves perfectly with the general will, then when the general will speaks, when the collectivity acts, when we pass a law, when we pass a proposition, it won't make us unfree. So we can have a potentially quite powerful sovereign. We can have a sovereign who has something like the power of life and death over us and still not be made unfree by them, because the sovereignty is the collectivity, right? It's the collective will, it's the general will. And to give you a sense of just how far Rousseau means this, let's take a look here at chapter 7. Yeah. So in chapter 7, he establishes that the sovereign, it really has the characteristics of Hobbes's sovereign, right? In the sense that, as we read here, since the body politic or the sovereign derives its being solely from the sanctity of the contract, it cannot oblige itself to do anything that derogates from this original deed, for instance, to alienate some portion of itself or to submit to some other sovereign. Um, so, uh, so the sovereign, in other words, sovereignty understood as the general will, sovereignty cannot be divided, right? In the same way that Hobbes says it cannot be divided, it cannot be forfeited, it cannot be used by another power, it cannot be, it cannot be wrong. It must be absolute, in other words. And again, this isn't absolute power given over to one person or one collective of people. It's absolute power as exercised by the community. right? The general will is the expression of this absolute power. So we are at no point do we become subject to anyone or into any group of people. We're only ever subject to ourselves. Again, with the understanding that in this case, our self refers to this new collective self that we've made. And to give you a sense of just how far this goes, um, here's what he writes on 58. For each individual can have as a man a personal will that is contrary or dissimilar to the general will that he has as a citizen. His personal interest can speak to him quite differently from the common interest. His mode of existence, absolute and independent, can make him regard what he owes to the common cause as a gratuitous contribution, the loss of which will be less onerous to others than its payment is for him. And envisaging the artificial person in which the state consists as an abstract being on the grounds that it is not a man, he would thus enjoy the rights of his citizens while declining to fulfill the duties of a subject, an example of injustice which, if it were to spread, um, would bring the ruin of the body politic. Uh, so in other words, Rousseau is identifying precisely the arrangement that we just came to. There will always be the kind of duality of interests. There always will be me, an individual who has interests, and the collectivity who has interests. In America today, we don't really expect anything from anyone beyond what their individual interest requires. Right? Rousseau says, as long as this goes on, as long as it's the case that an individual can serve their own interests and not pay any heed whatsoever to the collective interest, as long as that will go on, the body politic will always be teetering on the edge of disaster. And not only that, but we'll always see what the government requires of us or what the sovereignty requires of us as an imposition. So the tax bill comes and we'll be pissed off about taxes, right? This is just something I have to pay. We'll never see that taxes is a duty that we've placed on ourselves, right? And when the cop pulls us over and gives us a ticket, we'll be pissed off about it. And we'll never see that, in fact, we ourselves, we want a community in which the roads are safe. This requires enforcement. And so these are just rules that we've subjected ourselves to. For Rousseau, the unfreedom of the modern nation state is a result of the fact that we do not closely enough identify with the ruling power. We do not fully associate with the sovereign. I'm going to leave it off here today. We'll pick up here tomorrow. I'll email you guys with some slightly modified readings. If you're wondering, this sounds kind of crazy. This sounds like totalitarianism. I mean, that's a good intuition to have. There is something scary about what Rousseau is describing here, right? All forms of collectivism, whether they be communism or fascism or any of the other sort of scary 20th century isms, they all can trace some of their intellectual lineage back to Rousseau, and in particular, back to this idea that freedom under the state cannot be had while the individual sees himself as, in some sense, separate from the state. But tomorrow we'll talk about, a little bit about why Rousseau, I think, stands somewhat outside of that tradition and why he sees himself anyway as a kind of radical Democrat. All right, we'll leave off there for today.